Okay, so show of hands. Who here has ever made a rule? Who here has ever made a rule? R-U-L-E, a rule. Made a rule? I see one hand up. There we go. Enforced a rule? You can keep those hands up if you want to. Or followed a rule? Who here has broken a rule or two before? There we go. That's the most hands I feel like there. Okay, I'm going to ask Alvaro's help here. Alvaro, do you mind taking this out to the community? We've got some questions. So would anyone mind sharing a rule that you have created, either for your home, in your office, if you taught, maybe some of your teachers I know? Who would like to share a rule that you have created? Don't be shy. I've got one way in the back. We've got Valerie. Thank you, Valerie. Way back there. Hustle up. There you go, Alvaro.
Long ago, but when my kids were little, the rule was we took our shoes off as soon as we came in the house, which they followed. And the other rule was then you put them in the basket, which they did not follow. So they were always all in front of the door.
Wait, and Valerie, why did you create that rule?
Because I don't like a lot of dirt tracked in the house.
You don't like the dirt tracked in your house. Yes. They sharing a rule that you have enforced. So you didn't create it, but you enforced a rule. You moved, Heather. You shouldn't have moved.
My kids have to do 20 minutes of reading each night per their school, so I have enforced that rule. Fortunately, they like to read, so it's not that hard, but I've definitely had to remind them several times.
Why did you make, because not, every parent would make the choice to enforce that rule. Why did you make the choice to enforce that rule?
Several reasons. It's a family value that we try to adhere to the reasonable rules of the school, and it's a family value that they educate themselves and try to do well in school and apply effort in school.
Okay, thank you. So a family value. Thank you for sharing. And who here would like to share a rule that you have followed? Oh, we've got, okay, hand shot up over here. There we go. Oh, that was much easier. Yes.
There was a rule my mother created when I was small, and it was no candy before noon, which is a rule I still can't break.
And why did you follow that rule? It's very easy to sneak candy.
You didn't know my mother.
If my mother had set that rule, I would also follow it. So I get where you're coming from. Thank you for sharing. So, rules, Alvaro, good job. Thank you. Rules shape our lives, don't they? Sometimes they protect us. Sometimes they help us grow. They can help us stay healthy, help things remain clean and in order. And then sometimes rules just control us. And as the old saying goes, there are some rules that are just meant to be broken, right? One of my mentors had a little placard on her desk in her office with a quote that said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." Anyone familiar with that quote? Show of it. Yes, I see some folks raise their hands. So that quote, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," has been attributed to everyone from Marilyn Monroe to Eleanor Roosevelt, but it was actually first coined by the feminist Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian in 1976, I believe, the mid-70s. So she published an article that was discussing the lives of well-behaved or virtuous women in early America. And her whole point was that history tends to focus on those who disrupt the status quo rather than those who simply adhere to societal norms. As a kid, growing up, I wanted to be a bunch of different things. A lawyer for a long time, a fashion designer, that was never going to work out, a teacher, a coach. But of all the things I wanted to do, I knew that I always wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and I wanted to change the world and make it a better place. That was the one thing that I kept coming back to. And I loved this quote, well-behaved women seldom make history, that was on my mentor's desk. And I thought, yes, I'm going to be one of those women. But at the end of the day, I'm a rule follower.
And an enforcer.
And apparently an enforcer. Thank you all for Now, my nieces would be quick to point out that I am not a rule follower, which I think that's the ants' rule, right? The thought of disrupting the status quo was scary. I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want to make people mad. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that there are rules out there that aren't about safety. They aren't about protecting people. They aren't about the wellness of the entire community. They aren't looking out for people's best interests. There are rules out there that are designed to suppress, to control, and to maintain power. And those rules, my friends, are certainly worth disrupting. When we look at today's scripture, it's easy to villainize the synagogue leader who scolds Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. But let's put ourselves in his shoes. He was the steward of the temple. He was responsible for and was entrusted with keeping the order, with maintaining the traditions that had been passed down from generation to generation. He probably thought that he was doing the faithful thing, enforcing these rules, living up to his promises as a leader of this faith community for the good of his community. And maybe he's not wrong. I mean, this woman that Jesus healed, she had been bent over for 18 years. This wasn't an emergency situation. It wasn't life or death. What harm would waiting one more day do? But Jesus reminded him and everyone there and us of the heart of Sabbath. Sabbath is about freedom. It's remembering that God liberated the Israelites from Pharaoh and the endless cycle of work. And Sabbath is about wholeness. It's making space for life and rest and communal healing. So when Jesus lays on his hands on this daughter of Abraham and Sarah and sets her free, he is doing what Sabbath has always meant to do. This is one of those moments when Jesus is what I like to call a holy disruptor. He breaks a rule to keep the deeper commandment, to give life and freedom and compassion and dignity. And he stands in a long line of disruptors who embodied God's justice. You know, John Lewis called it good trouble. From Selma to the halls of Congress, he put his body on the line for civil rights, guided by his faith and belief in the beloved community. And Dorothy Day, she co-founded the Catholic worker movement and disrupted the comfortable alliance between church and wealth. She insisted that the works of mercy, of feeding and sheltering and caring, were not optional, but were central to the gospel and central to the call of the church's work. And Óscar Romero, Archbishop of San Salvador, who began as a cautious and conservative church leader, but was transformed as he witnessed the suffering of his people. He became a voice for the poor, denouncing state violence until he was assassinated at the altar of his church. These are holy disruptors, people who paid attention to what was happening in the lives of those members of their community, in the lives of their neighbors. They paid attention to the Spirit and listened to where God was still speaking, where God was calling them to challenge the systems of oppression and point us back to God's vision of liberation and wholeness for everyone. Now, there's something else in this story that's important for us to name and to pay attention to. The bent-over woman never asked to be healed. She didn't seek Jesus out. He saw her and he called her forward. And this disruption carried risk for her too. We don't know what happened to her when she went back into the community, when she was healed. We don't know how people treated her or what they said about her. We can imagine that there was certainly gossip, right? Liberation can be costly. And that's why when we step into holy disruption today, we must be careful never to use those who are most impacted as props for our own causes. We must never use those who are impacted as props for our own causes. Instead, we ask permission, we invite them along as co-conspirators, we take a back seat to honor and empower and lift up their voices. Otherwise, disrupting just becomes another form of oppression. So let me ask you, this is a rhetorical question. Alvaro's not going to come around with a microphone. Take a deep breath, you're good. What religious norms and values do you uphold? What religious norms and values do you uphold? Think about that. You know, some of us have had to do this hard work already. We've had to disrupt the norms that we were raised with, sometimes painfully, sometimes at great cost. Maybe you grew up in a church or a household that told you who you could and who you couldn't love, how you could dress, what toys you could play with, how you could speak, what you were allowed to believe, what was off limits to ask about or talk about. Maybe you are no longer part of those communities because of those rules. And I imagine that the work of disrupting your own inherited norms has not been easy. It may have come with loss, with grief, with rejection. And I admire your bravery and your courage to do that work. And I hold space for you and lift you up in prayer as you continue to journey through it. But I hope and I pray that in the midst of this difficult disrupting, that it has also been liberating. That in choosing disruption, you've caught a glimpse of the freedom and the dignity that God longs for all of us. You know, there are some norms that are small, like sitting in the same pew every Sunday and feeling a little thrown off when someone takes your seat. Or expecting Welch's grape juice at communion. I'm not ready to change that one yet. But other norms, as we know, well, their disruption creates much bigger ripples in the life of the community. Some of those rules and those norms still give life. And others, well, they weigh us down. And the tough work of a faithful community is discerning the difference and not closing the door on God's holy disruptors. Where is God still speaking, still healing, still freeing, still calling, even when it unsettles the order of things? So I leave you with these questions. And I want us to take some time, a moment of silence or two, to let them sink in. What needs disrupting in your life? What needs disrupting in your life? What needs disrupting in our church? Little c and big C. What needs disrupting in our country? In our world? And just as important, how might we need to be disrupted? How will we respond when God unsettles our comfort and challenges our assumptions and calls us into something new? And do we have the courage, with God's help, to do it? Do we have the courage to do it so that all of God's children may live fully and free? May it be so. Amen.